Okay, good morning, everyone. Quite a number of people have joined, so we'll start. This webinar is also being recorded, and we'll make available a link for people who haven't participated. Okay, during the webinar, we will have available a Q&A in the corner. You should be able to see at the bottom of your screens a Q&A box. When we respond to Q&As, we will not reveal the identity of the people asking questions, so feel free to ask questions. And we will also have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So thank you for joining everyone on this webinar. Just to briefly introduce the people who will be talking today to you. From CERC, we have the founder and CEO, Fernando Fontes, together with the product director for Duplicatas, João Bragança. From the Hogan Lovells team, you have myself, Jonathan Lewis, a partner in São Paulo. And from the Pinheiro Neto Brazilian lawyers team, you have Bruno Balducci, Balducini, and Tiago Lassa, who are partners in the banking and finance group. So first of all, what we will do is basically just hand over to Fernando to set the scene in relation to Duplicatas Escriturais.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. First of all, I want to thank Hogan Lovells for giving me to speak. And I want to thank Pinheiro Neto for joining us in today's session. Brazil is a market characterized by significant information asymmetry, a lot of legal uncertainties, and causes limited depth in its credit sector. It's very dependent on collateral to lend to, especially for SMEs in Brazil, or even for individuals. It's an economy that's very dependent on collateral. According to the World Bank, we have the second highest spread in the world today, and a very, very big elevated default rates, delinquency rates, and a very low credit to GDP ratio. Over the years, Brazil tried to address this with many economic reforms, focused on strengthening the collateral framework. Around 23 years ago, we have a major improvement in the Brazilian regulation to allow payroll loans to be a very strong collateral for credit. And now payroll loans represent around 80% of all the personal loans in Brazil. And this was one of the inspirations that we have that inspired us to build the same framework for the corporate loans that took place for individuals 20 years ago. Other innovations in the legal framework in Brazil involving using vehicles or real estate as a collateral with the introduction of fiduciary alienation, improved a lot the collateral security for improving and increasing the loans to individuals that wanted to buy a new car or a new home. And these three alternatives in Brazil, auto loans, home equity or home financing, and payroll loans, are the biggest credit markets for individuals and the only alternative that an individual has in Brazil to access credit for an adequate spread and also for a long-term loan using these three types of collateral that the individuals in Brazil have. More recently, 4 years ago, we had the introduction of central registration of accounts receivables, starting with credit cards receivables. Central bank decided to deploy an infrastructure for registering all the accounts receivables of the merchants in Brazil. So every shop in Brazil that accepts a payment card now has its receivables centralized in the system. That central bank authorized to work as a notary, to make pledges, to register through sale transactions involving cards receivables in Brazil. Cards receivables in Brazil are very different. Cards in Brazil work in a very different way than in other countries. In Brazil, the settlement is deferred and you have installments in the card schema. So you can buy anything and pay in 12 installments, for example. And for this reason, the shops in Brazil, the merchants, they have a lot of receivables to use as a collateral for working capital or for a discount in a bank. And this market, after the registration of these receivables, these cards receivables, the credit market for merchants in Brazil tripled in size, and the spreads reduced around 75% in these remaining 4 years. So building a centralized database with 100% of the accounts receivables of the shops in Brazil, even in marketplaces, electronic e-commerce, so sellers of all the marketplaces like Mercado Livre or Amazon or any other marketplaces in Brazil. Now these sellers have their receivables centralized and they can do business with any financial service provider, any lender, and offer the receivables as a collateral. It's a very good collateral in Brazil, and it's very similar to what the payroll loans made for the individual. So it's kind of the payroll of the companies when we look at the accounts receivables, especially for millions of Brazilians that are, for example, Uber drivers or have a small business in the garage of its home. They have now the chance to access credit using these receivables equivalent to a payroll loan. Receivables in Brazil, accounts receivables in general, are the biggest asset class. And one of the reasons is the fact that since we have a low credit to GDP ratio, banks have not improved the credit offer to companies, and the companies have to use their own balance sheet to finance their clients. It does not happen only in the retail market, in the shops and merchants, as I mentioned, but any corporate B2B transaction in Brazil, you have to finance your client. You have to provide a long term for your client to pay, because it's very tough to raise capital in Brazil or to find the amount of working capital your business need, or to have a bank to finance all your suppliers. So it's very common that the company's balance sheet, the corporate balance sheet, is used to compensate the absence of the banks in financing the economy needs. And this environment, together with the fact that we have high interest rates, high spreads, it's very challenging for corporate companies in Brazil, and puts a lot of pressure on Brazilian businesses and consumers alike. This is the reason that every reform in Brazil that unlocks the credit market, reduces the spread, improves the market depth, the inclusion of new companies to access credit, are essential for the sustainable growth and competitiveness of the local market. We founded CERC 10 years ago in 2015, inspired by the capital markets, where you have the securities being traded, very liquid instruments using clearinghouses to provide all the settlement and providing all the security that the markets need to thrive. And the securities infrastructure market was our inspiration to help Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance to improve the Brazilian regulation, focused on the biggest asset class we have in Brazil, trade invoices. Trade invoices in Brazil are, of course, when you look at the value chain, when we look at cards receivables, we're talking about B2C transactions, when you sell your product to the final client. But when we go down the value chain, you have many other companies that provided all the resources needed to build the final product that you sell to your consumer. So it means the value chain in Brazil originates trillions of reais, trillions of dollars, around 2 to 3 trillions of dollars a year in B2B receivables, in trade invoice receivables. And central bank decided around 8 years ago to work together with the Brazilian Congress to improve the trade receivables regulation in Brazil. The duplicata, the Brazilian trade receivable, is very old, as we are going to discuss today. It's an instrument that has more than 100 years of history, but it was very old as well in terms of how the regulation, the legal aspects were defined. So central bank worked together with the Congress to improve that, and we worked together with central bank to deploy the new regulation in receivables clearinghouse for trade invoices, the same way we built that for cards 4 years ago. So it's very good analogy with what took place with cards, and we expect as well to have a big reduction in spreads, and also the credit markets to multiply at least for 3 to up to 5 times the size that the credit market has in Brazil for working capital to these B2B companies. CERC became authorized by the central bank to be a registrar of receivables in 2018. We expected the trade invoices to be deployed in 2020, but central bank, the pandemic caused central bank to accelerate the cards receivables registration, and so central bank decided to deploy cards before trade invoices, because all the merchants in Brazil were suffering a lot, closing their shops based on what the pandemic effects were causing to the economy. And it was the best decision, so we could help these companies to survive during the pandemic. And now central bank put all his efforts and energy together with us to deploy the trade invoices infrastructure. And we were recently as well approved to be a full clearinghouse by the central bank for any asset class, and also by CVM, by our SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission in Brazil. Yesterday authorized us to be also clearinghouse, a central securities depository, and a clearinghouse for any security that has a receivable as the underlying asset. And it means all the investment funds that buy receivables in Brazil, the FIDICs, or any other credit-linked note or any other asset instrument that has a receivable as its underlying asset.
That's great.
Just to close here, I want to thank Hogan Lovells again for inviting us, and I am 100% available to address any questions that you may have today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Fernando. So just to contextualize today's webinar, it's primarily aimed at international and local financing providers that are looking at duplicatas from the perspective of financing and collateral opportunities. The Brazilian local market, in terms of companies and also financial institutions, is obviously running very, very closely with all the implementation process for duplicatas. So this webinar here is more aimed at an international audience, because we're sort of seeing a lot more interest in the following specifically. When we look at this scenario on screen now, that it illustrates you very clearly the potential for duplicatas. If you look at a company, if you're financing a Brazilian company that's basically pledged all of its assets that are available to pledge, how can a company expand the collateral pool? How can a company increase its collateral coverage? How can it improve its loan-to-value ratio? Now, once the Duplicatas Escriturais regime is implemented, this will be a significant answer to that question. and will be a significant assistance for Brazilian companies looking at doing secured lending. And at this point, I'll hand it over to the Pinheiro Neto team to give us a little bit of an introduction on the background to Duplicatas.
Okay, I can start, and Thiago, please jump in whenever you want. So Duplicata, trade receivable, I don't think there is a direct translation, right, Jonathan, for what this instrument is a title of credit or credit instrument, but is a little bit different than the traditional credit instrument. Usually, if you issue a promissory note, the debtor issue a promissory notes to the beneficiary. A duplicata is something similar, but who issues the instrument is the creditor. So if the supplier provides goods and services and the buyer has an obligation to pay, the supplier issues a trade bill against the buyer, who then will recognize the existence of this obligation to pay, and that's how you create a duplicata. So it is a credit instrument, but it's issued by the creditor, not by the debtor, but once it's confirmed by the debtor, becomes similar to a promissory note. So this is the main characteristic. Duplicata is something super ancient in Brazil, always existed, but without technology. And in fact, because of the lack of technology, you see some larger banks doing specific programs, trade bill financing, but you never seen, as Jonathan said, situations like a project finance or other situations where a person that is being financed could use this trade receivables as collateral. The reason is, until now, we didn't have a centralized register. And therefore, there was always a risk that the duplicata really didn't exist. And in fact, we did see in the past fake duplicata. So someone would say, oh, I have this obligation, creates a duplicata, but in fact, it didn't exist. And so there was a lot of fraud, and the duplicatas really only work nowadays for larger groups, or for example, a car manufacturer that has a relationship with all the suppliers and therefore wants to create a program to finance its suppliers. So this is usually the characteristic in Brazil. Now, just to everyone be on the same side here, so basically is the central bank decided, as Fernando said, to first receive statutory power to regulate this. So it went into Congress, there was a specific law, and transform this credit instrument is a financial asset. And there is a specific law that was created, I think Thiago was really involved in this in the past, that started to dedicate or list what would constitute a financial asset. And it would basically give powers to registers to register these assets as if a cartório, a public, did. So basically you would replace the cartório, which is a very Brazilian thing, into an electronic register, which has effect over third parties. So in other words, once you register the duplicata into the system, it is worth and has erga omnes effect. In other words, affects everyone, and nobody can claim ignorance or knowledge that there was a duplicata, that the duplicata was given in collateral, or the duplicata was sold to someone. And so interestingly then, as you can see on the left box, the duplicata is from 1968. It's a very ancient regulation, and it was all physical. And the register is actually someone that had a big physical book with leather coverings, and it would write down one by one of the duplicatas and would register duplicata. And then obviously what the central bank did is that, okay, the idea is great because it is a form of financing or collateral, but then based on the regulations, they issued the same idea but a fully percent electronic, and created companies like CERC, allow companies like CERC to be the register for this transaction. So that's the main change here in the regulation. Can go to the next.
And as Bruno said, sometimes the translation and the terminology can be half the problem in duplicatas. So we thought we'd put on this slide here just a little page for you, and we'll send these slides around afterwards. But we have what we would typically think of as the company, so is basically the supplier, the drawer, sacador, fornecedor, who is selling goods to a buyer who's buying on delayed payment terms, the draweree, sacado, comprador. And then the financing provider is obviously the financing provider that will use the duplicatas to be able to finance the supplier. And on the right-hand side of the page here, we just put a little note to say that even though we're talking a lot in terms of kind of short-term supplies, maybe, kind of manufacturing type situations, this duplicatas or escriturais are also relevant in the context of maybe long-term supply contracts as well, because even if you have a long-term supply contract, the individual payments under that on a periodic basis may be supported by duplicatas escriturais as well. So the next page we have here is basically sort of showing in general how the digitization of this market will reform trade receivables. As we can see on the left-hand side of the page, we have trade receivables that will be easily visible and transactable. As Fernando explained very well at the beginning, this reduces market asymmetries and expands the potential universe of financing providers. What do I mean by that? I mean the expanded use of financing providers who can use these duplicatas in order to offer supply financing to companies. There will be a centralized mandatory register of trade receivables. There'll be multiple registrars in the market, of which CERC is one of them. And the registrars will be what people refer to as the single source of truth. As Bruno said, historically there was potentially a lot of fraud in duplicatas. Moving to an electronic register creates a lot more legal certainty and also expands the possibilities for the different types of transactions that we will be talking about today. And then hand it back over to Pinheiro Neto for some.
Yeah. So just one comment on that is that, like CERC, there are other registers, not as good as CERC, but there are other registers, and there is something called interoperability. So in other words, if I decide to register, create a trade bill with CERC, automatically CERC will interoperate with the other registrars that are being approved by the central bank, and the information appears in all registers. So if a financier goes to another register and wants to see, and has obtained all the approvals, wants to see, it will be able to see that there is a duplicata that was created by or registered in the CERC system. And if there is a collateral given in that other register, that information will cross back to CERC, and it will appear that that duplicata has been given in collateral for a financing and therefore is not available for trade. So there is this interoperability of all the registers so that the information is only one and the client can choose which register it will use or the financier. So that's an interesting as well. I know, Thiago, you want to go here on this?
Yeah, the comment that I wanted to to add in here to what Bruno explained, folks, and connecting a little bit with also what Fernando said in the beginning and Jonathan as well, is how all this modernization, if you will, of the duplicatas can provide a very good opportunity on fostering financing using this as collateral. And not only the legislation that you folks are seeing here in this slide shows the fact that, in 2018, it was the first movement by the legislator to actually allow the duplicata to leave the physical form from the 68 law and become an electronic duplicata. So the Duplicatas Escriturais, which can then benefit from the infrastructure of registrars in Brazil, and as a consequence, the ability to perfect collateral in those market infrastructures. And this is not, I think it's important to highlight, folks, that this is not a novelty under Brazilian legislation and regulation. Duplicatas Escriturais are surfing a wave that has been a very successful wave for other asset types and other financing transactions, which transaction times have been way more successful after these similar changes were implemented on their specific legislation. And I'm referring to the possibility of creating and perfecting collateral over securities, also in market infrastructures, also in electronic form, as well as other financial assets such as bank deposits, govies, and so on and so forth. All of these are connected efforts, and the Duplicata Escritural is also a connected effort led by the central bank over the last, I would say, roughly 20 years, but with more success over the last 10 years, in which the central bank fostered and led the discussions in Brasilia to allow let's call the change of the perfection and the creation and perfection of collateral on, as Bruno mentioned, in notaries, which are typically way more slower, way more bureaucratic process rather than doing it everything electronically. And it's not only the creation and perfection that you can implement electronically, but also the foreclosure of the collateral can also be implemented through the same systems, which does allow way more efficiency, to some extent cost reduction, but way more important, I think, timing on how you can implement those collateral structures. And I'm referring to the fact that if we look to other financial transactions that benefited earlier from this structure that will now be available to Duplicatas Escriturais. Again, securities and other asset and other financial assets, and which type of trades started existing in Brazil, which they were very scarce before that. Equity financing transactions, collar financing transactions, margin loans, all of these, which have been fairly liquid in the international markets for quite a few decades, they were very scarce in Brazil. And they were scarce because the way you would be able, in order to perfect collateral over equity, it would take time. It would take you 1 week, 2 weeks to be able to complete the whole perfection of the collateral. And that was per se completely that would put a bottleneck in the transaction that you could not implement it, as typically a margin loan needs to work, as typically a collar finance needs to work. Here, the Duplicatas Escriturais will benefit from exactly the same legal infrastructure, which has been tested, and it's working pretty well on all these other financial assets. So it would allow not only the certainty that Bruno mentioned regarding that the duplicata exists, that it's not backed by any sort of fraudulent transaction, and also the legal certainty that once you have properly perfected your collateral in a market infrastructure such as CERC, you are then assured that duplicata belongs to you from a collateral perspective, of course, for that you are the beneficiary of the collateral over that duplicata, and no one else can take a lien over that, and you can implement that perfection very quickly. And of course, the consequent ability to foreclose in a more efficient way, also with respect to that collateral. So for sure, this if we take if we look the parallel to other financial transactions that have benefited earlier from this legal infrastructure that is now being made available to the duplicatas, we can see how successful this can be once this registration and perfection of collateral mechanism can be implemented through market infrastructure such as CERC. So I think this shows this evolution of Brazilian regulation and legislation is not. I think we should not look at it as something independent. I think the good news is that this is a connected effort of the central bank to make sure that it fosters credit transactions, it fosters the decrease of credit spread, interest rates, and so on. So I think that's the whole legal background and the legal framework that is now becoming available to Duplicatas Escritural.
And I think two additional points that I would make. It makes me very proud to be Brazilian, actually, because really Brazil is leading the way here globally. Like, we don't have many examples at all of this happening, these sort of regimes being put in place globally. We have a few examples in Latin America, but much more limited and not exactly the same, and not as transparent and not as transformative as what the Duplicatas Escriturais regime is taking place. And secondly, everything we're talking about here sounds very Brazilian, but I can assure the international kind of investors and banks on the call here that we regularly, all the time, do international financing secured by credit card receivables. Very, very normal. Whilst this is a lot of language and terminology and changes, the end result will be that the duplicatas, which are 2 or 3 times the size of credit card receivables, will become a standard, routine, ordinary course collateral that can be used both for Brazilian and international financings.
Yeah. And Jonathan, I don't know if Fernando or João have the information. What is the expected size of the trade receivable market compared to the credit card?
We had that on the slide before. Basically, the credit card receivable market is 6 trillion versus the duplicatas for in respect of products is 11 trillion.
Right.
So it's almost 2 times the size.
Right.
And the data of Duplicatas considers only the sale of merchandise, only the merchant transactions, not the services. So if we look at services provided in Brazil that can be duplicata may be issued on a service. For example, if a law firm issues a duplicata, it's valid for the new regulation as a duplicata escritural. And this is another around 4 trillion reais, so another $800 billion that is not in this 11 trillion. This 11 trillion is only merchandise that is sold based on the data from the IRS in Brazil.
Thank you.
So, Jonah, is that you or you want me to go here?
Yeah, you can go.
Sure. So I don't know what happened. I created this red marking. I hope it's not appearing here. Sorry for that.
It's okay.
So basically what the rule says is that there is no more physical duplicatas. So basically duplicatas are 100% electronic. They can only be electronic form. And the most interesting thing, remember I mentioned in the beginning of the conversation that there was a lot of fraud. And the reason is there was no cross-referencing of information between the service rendered or the goods delivered. And what happened, the central bank, very knowledgeable about the situation, basically created a system whereby when CERC creates a duplicata, it cross-reference with the tax side. So in other words, every duplicata that is issued is cross-reference with the electronic invoice system. So in other words, if you paid an invoice, electronic invoice, it means that you provided the services or you deliver goods, because you cannot even transfer goods without a electronic invoice. So the fact that the IRS, the Brazilian IRS, is connected to the system basically brings the necessary certainty that the duplicata actually exists because someone did provide a service or did provide delivery of goods, because they need the nota fiscal or NFE for that. So that's a very quite unique Brazilian thing whereby you are connected to the IRS to improve certainty of the existence. The second thing is that the settlement of this or the money being sent to the beneficiary is only done by electronic means, and you can use obviously the PIX. However, due to the age of the duplicatas, basically what happens is that the original model was heavily relied on what we call the boletos, which is the bar-coded system of Brazil, whereby a bank issues a payment slip on behalf of a beneficiary. And you can pay in any bank by having the bank reading this QR code together with the barcode together with the payment. And so what happened is that they created what we call the dynamic boletos. In other words, so if a boleto is issued to the benefit of the service provider, the supplier, therefore, when the payment is made, what happens is the bank that issued this barcoded instrument will receive its money on its reserves, and then will have to transfer money to the supplier. If for any reason this duplicata was assigned, given in collateral, or any reason to a third party, at the time of settlement, the boleto has the necessary intelligence to automatically divert the money to the final beneficiary of that transaction, avoiding the risk for a financing party that the money goes to the debtor or to someone else who then will not redirect the money. So the central bank was very smart. Together with CERC, they created this concept of the boleto inteligente or can use the PIX. And the same logic applies to the PIX. At the time of payment, the money goes directly to the beneficiary or can go to CERC, who then will direct to the beneficiary. So you have these two options. But the fact is that there is no flow of money to the person that has given that in collateral, the original beneficiary. So that's a quite as well unique. And I guess basically that's it. And it's obviously very tied to the underlying asset. So any payment is always linked to the duplicata, which is what is the good or service being rendered.
Thank you. And yeah, just to underscore the dynamic boleto point, imagine issuing an invoice where you print on the bottom of your invoice, please pay account 12345. That's no longer the case with the dynamic boleto. In theory, it wouldn't say please pay whatever account. It says please pay the account that's linked electronically, which could change when the duplicata is transacted. Okay, next page.
That's it. Just a comment. It's like a programmable accounts receivable. We always talk about digital currency, for example, and the beauty of programming a digital currency and use, for example, blockchain for doing DVP settlement. But in fact, the system that we're discussing here, it creates the opportunity to program the accounts receivable and change the settlement account, the domicile where the money will be deposited based on the contract. So it's very similar to what other countries are doing, but instead of using a digital currency, we are using the collection of the company, all the accounts receivables being programmed based on the contract that the lender made with the borrower.
Thank you, Fernando. And this page really, it summarizes stuff that we've already just talked about anyway, in terms of how the Duplicatas Escriturais are innovative. The central registration and bookkeeping enables financing transactions. We've talked about the ability for financing providers to look at the agenda of the company. We've talked about the ability to use those receivables freely, and the safe and reliable domicile, which is literally just what we've been speaking about a few seconds ago. And maybe Bruno or Tiago, you just want to kind of talk a little bit about the concept of the agenda of a company's duplicatas?
Sure. So what happens is that since it's a centralized system, once a duplicata is created and registered, it becomes available to show what credits that supplier will have in the system. So the interesting thing is that you can start registering, and upon consent and access by banks, financial institutions, credit funds, or fintech, they will have the visibility of all trade bills available that they can either purchase, finance, receive as collateral, or whatever. So it is a centralized system, as I mentioned before, but with full visibility as to what that supplier has and who is the owner, who owes that money. In other words, the drawee. In other words, so if a bank wants to receive a collateral in a financing business, and it knows that Petrobras owes the money to the supplier, then obviously I'll be looking in Petrobras credit risk, and therefore the bank would be very interested in receiving that duplicata as collateral. So the technology basically allows all this agenda, all this information of current and future, so that the financing parts, the credit funds, the fintechs can join. The logic of the central bank here is similar to the credit card. If you have competition and you have information available, this will draw discounts and interest rates down. So it's creating competition as part of the central bank agenda for that. So it's quite an interesting model again. And once you register this agenda in one register, it becomes available on the other register due to the interoperability model.
Great, thank you. And just to reorientate people where we are in the webinar so far, we're now just going to talk about the timetable for the implementation, and then we have a few slides that go into a little bit more detail on the structures and diagrams for the types of transactions that we've been talking about. So guys, feel free to jump in at any point here. So things have already started. In December, so this month, the CERC and other registrars started the test period, which is basically the central bank testing the ability of the registrars to be able to process transactions and comply with the relevant technical provisions of the law. And assuming that will all go ahead as planned, then the trial period and early adoption of Duplicatas Escriturais would start in April 2026. And that sort of trial period, early adoption period runs through to October 2026. And after that, We have a mandatory adoption period, which is phased in according to companies with different sizes of invoicing, starting with the largest companies and then moving down to smaller companies. And it is worth emphasizing that even though the mandatory adoption period has a phase in, we would be expecting a large amount of companies to effectively early adopt, which they can do from later on next year, as you can see. I'm not sure if Fernando, Bruno, Tiago João want to give any more color on the timetable.
I just want to show that the dynamic boleto is starting in October, and in our point of view, from October on, any bank will be capable of changing the bank account of any boleto. So it's a new feature that we never had before. For example, if I'm an international investor or financier that has no cash management solutions in Brazil, is not a cash management provider of local companies, he will have a chance from October on of changing the domicile of the payment slips of any Brazilian company. Not only the boletos that were already issued, but the future boletos based on the long-term financing, for example, that was provided or any other transaction. And so it's going to be the moment, in my point of view, where competition will be very intense because we have many banks in Brazil that are very good, have all the skills to lend money to companies, but are not very relevant in terms of cash management and collection of boletos. But these banks will have the chance to compete in the same level playing field of other banks that now has biggest market share in the boletos market. So I think October will be a very relevant milestone for the project in general to bring a lot of competition for the credits.
Great, thank you. So now we have a few slides here which are sort of busy with diagrams and boxes, just to try and provide a little bit more diagrammatic color on some of these transactions. So the left-hand side of your screen is really talking about the creation of the duplicata, and then the opt-in phase, which is really a phase where companies are able to grant access to financing providers to be able to look at the agenda of receivables, which we've talked about on the previous slides, and that enables the analysis. And then, what does all this unlock? This unlocks, three broad types of transactions, but of course, when the market starts to mature, we may see different types of transactions and different use cases. But three broad sort of types of transactions that we're going to talk briefly about would be the acquisition, the purchase of duplicatas by a financing provider. A nuance to that would be a forward sale of future duplicatas for massa, whereby not only present duplicatas are sold, but also future ones. And then thirdly, the granting of collateral for financing provided. So registering a collateral interest rather than an absolute sale of the relevant duplicata. And the right-hand side of the screen is effectively sort of saying that all of those types of transactions would be recorded in the register. And guys, feel free to jump in at any point with any more color. This is a very complicated diagram, but effectively it's sort of showing you in detail how the electronic plumbing of the registrars works in order to effectuate and grant, legal certainty and, transactional certainty through the transactions that we're talking about. Not sure if either Fernando, João, or Bruno or Tiago want to emphasize anything in particular here.
I just want to say, regarding to the previous slide, when we talk about the data access, we always think about a photograph of the accounts receivables, the current accounts receivables. But in fact, we'll have a streaming. You will have the history of all the accounts receivables in the past that were settled. And so right now, you have asymmetry between all the lenders because you have no history of the accounts receivables performance of a certain client. But when you centralize the data, doesn't matter if the client is recent in a certain bank, you can check the history of the receivables performance of previous years. And this will help the banks to be much more making decisions based on the client's data, and not only on their balance sheets, but also on their accounts receivables data, a very granular information that the market doesn't have right now.
Good point.
I think Jonathan
And
here
anything-
is drawing the attention. If you look at the boxes number 1, 2, and 3. So that's where I mentioned that, which is quite unique, right? There is a sale of goods and services. Then you have the invoice issuance, and this is linked to the Brazilian IRS, and this will allow CERC to create the duplicata. So as I mentioned, this cross-reference between the real world and the tax authorities brings the necessary certainty about the model. So that's wanted to draw the attention here.
Yeah,
Great,
maybe
thank you.
Maybe something that we can also.
Try one more time. Oh, we seem to have an echo. Okay. Now we'll talk about phases in a forward sale. So this is more like a nuance to the previous slide. In terms of what a company would do here, it would enter into a forward purchase and sale agreement with a financing provider, whereby you say, hey, we agree a framework whereby all or certain future duplicatas would automatically be forward sold within certain conditions or frameworks. And so what that would be, that forward sale would be registered within CERC or another registrar. And then when those receivables are registered generated on an ongoing basis, the financing provider would receive the sale of those duplicatas, and then obviously you can see on the page here how the financing flows would work. Anything to hear? This is one of the things that I feel is a bit of a jabuticaba in Brazil, because we talk about duplicatas fumaça. I'm not sure if anyone wants to provide some more color from a Brazilian side.
I think the fumaça, because it's a smoke, it doesn't exist, but at the same time allows the supplier, if it wants, to basically insert in the system saying any and all duplicatas not existing today but once created can be used as collateral for a financing, for example. So what happens that this wish, because it's just a promise to register, promessa, basically is something that can be registerable in CERC system. So in other words, in CERC system, there will be an electronic note whereby once the duplicata is created, automatically is created with this encumbrance, because it has committed on a contractual point of view, private contracted, which then was registered and made available. So now has effect about third parties. And once it's created, automatically brings the certainty that nobody else will step in or the supplier will be able to sell it to someone else or giving collateral to someone else. So that's the interesting thing, is that based on a future wish, this will create an encumbrance, which automatically, once the duplicata is created, will benefit for that. So think about a project finance transaction or a long-term transaction, and the supplier who's getting a finance decides to give in collateral all and any of its duplicatas. This will bring a lot of legal certainty for a financier to enter this transaction because he knows it will have a protection of this collateral.
Yeah, if I may weigh in here, Bruno, I think an interesting aspect here, folks, for those hearing for the first time, the fumaça. I personally prefer the promise to issue duplicatas rather than calling it fumaça, as it actually relates and connects more to the actual legal rationale behind it, and I think it's important for those that are are not that knowledgeable of the day-to-day of how duplicatas are used in Brazil. So it is very common for service providers, and in trade commerce for people to have a continued relationships with their clients. So they will provide continually that a given service, or they will be providing certain goods on a continued basis to a given client. So they do have a commercial relationship that will generate continued, payment obligations coming from, whoever buys the goods or acquires those specific services that will allow the company, again, the creditor, as Bruno was explaining in the beginning, duplicata is a title of credit that the creditor is the one that issues the duplicata on its benefit, to issue these duplicatas in the future. So this is a way for the electronic systems to be able to accept this promise of duplicatas that will be issued in the future to be recognized within the electronic system. So it's one looking to it should not see it as how will this duplicata exist in the future. They will still be backed by a trade transaction or a service that has been provided due to this continued relationship that exists by these service providers or goods that are being sold on a continued basis to given customers.
Thank you. And the next page, this is really exciting from the perspective of someone like me that is a high yield financing lawyer and does a lot of restructuring and special situations with heavily indebted companies in Brazil. The prospect of what you see on the screen here is really very exciting. The idea that you can establish at the beginning of a financing transaction that the company would grant collateral on an ongoing basis over future receivables, either all of the receivables or a particular subset of receivables. So as we put at the bottom of the screen here, maybe over whatever amount of reais due on a particular period of time. As and when those receivables are recorded as Duplicatas Escriturais in the registrar system, the registrar basically configures that so that it pulls automatically, immediately, those records and effectively records against those duplicatas the collateral interest. And also that would grant you priority over in respect of that collateral. And any receivables that were not recorded as being specifically earmarked of a particular characteristic to a financing would then be available for other secured financings, or would be available for sale transactions, as we've talked about. Anything that you guys want to mention there particularly?
Just to draw that, you have so many parameters in terms of the kind of contracts you can register that you can build almost an eligibility criteria for the duplicatas that will be accepted as a collateral, and the system will do that automatically. So as long as the collateral is revolving, the system will respect all the parameters that the parties agreed upon on the contract, and making sure only eligible duplicatas will be linked to the note. And just an analogy with other situations where we see notes linked to the future flow of receivables. In Brazil, we have many transactions in the past in the capital markets of companies like a railroad company that raised money using the future train tickets as a collateral, or a pop star that may sell his future shows revenues to a SPV. But the difference here is that you don't have to worry about the collection of this in the future. You don't have to worry because since you're registering the contract now, 5 years from now, doesn't matter who are the clients of the company in the future, we will change the domicile and make sure the settlement will go to the right beneficiary of the pledge or the new owner of the receivable. And also foreclosure becomes much more easier, as Thiago mentioned.
That's great. And I think it's really cool to sort of understand the different nuances, as Fernando said, around the different criteria you can establish for these transactions. Whereas sort of, on a credit card basis, you might sort of say different credit card brand bands or so forth. But like here, you've got the ability to be very, very specific with the collateral and which financing provider gets which piece of the duplicatas. Very interesting. So now we're coming on to the last couple of slides before our question and answer session. So if you have any questions and answers, please feel free to put them in the chat at the bottom of the screen. We will receive those. Other people won't see them, but we will see them and we'll be able to respond to them. But just to recap, the next two slides are just recapping the benefits to the companies, operational agility, the ability to settle things in a very digitized way, the cost reduction in the same manner, scalability and new players, as we've all been speaking about on this call, the ability to have the open agenda to consult, to be able to get the credit history data to enable credit analysis, and regulatory scrutiny. You have a very solid regulated regime that has been established by the central bank, and obviously the different infrastructure providers, including CERC, are going through rigorous testing right now, in fact. And then recapping of the benefits to financing providers, sort of integration with the financial ecosystem. As Fernando has mentioned, very eloquently, in the past, these types of receivables have been the domain of a small number of large banks. Opening up the register enables integration. There's a big fintech story here and financial inclusion and that type of thing. It's sort of I almost think of it like the open banking of commercial companies here. Transparency in the receivables chain we've talked about. Easier perfection of collateral. So this is going to give financing providers much greater certainty and security over the collateral that they're taking. And we've already talked about data for credit analysis as well. So that's actually the end of our set of slides. Unless any one of my colleagues has any additional points to raise, we're just going to open up to Q&A if there are any Q&As available. We haven't got any questions yet. Anyone has any final sort of points you want to add in summary? Maybe Fernando, any closing words?
First, again, we are 100% available to help the depth that anyone wants to get on the understanding of the model in general, and also to discuss concrete situations where this could take place. We helped in recent years airline companies in Brazil that have to restructure all the debt and use their receivables, their cars receivables as a collateral, with leasing companies offshore and many other banks that had a consortium of lenders of certain airline companies in Brazil using the cars receivables, and other situations where cars receivables are being used as a collateral for international investors became common in Brazil in the last 4 years. And I think we will see the same as we deploy this trade invoices ecosystem, and many new opportunities will emerge, and we will be happy to help any Rogalovos, Pinheiro Neto, and any of the people present here to understand how would this work in the future and help to implement this in practical ways.
Yeah, I would add that, Jonathan, especially looking at the line of business, is we never used duplicatas as any kind of collateral for financing, especially in project finance, long-term projects, large size financing. And I think with this new regulation, I think it opens a new door that we did not have any precedents, but the fact that the system seems so efficient, I guess it will create a lot of alternatives, and hoping that, and we'll try to honor what the central bank is hoping, which is a cost reduction on financing, because you have a proper collateral, can be quickly foreclosed, has this legal security, and therefore. So I think it will have a large effect in midterm. Remember the timeline we had. We're going to start with larger companies, and next year we go, at the end of next year, for the medium and then small companies. And that's where I think the impact is going to be very, very large, which will allow these companies that are, reasonable size to enter new types of structural financing and benefiting from the Duplicata registration. So,
a final note on my end here, Jonathan, is that I think people looking to this product, as a lender, should also realize that, this type of bonds, Duplicatas are, essentially a bond. They are widely used in the Brazilian market, not even, restricted to a given sector of the economy. So you will see Duplicatas being used by retailers, distributors, service providers, agribusiness sector, all of this use Duplicata at large. So the ability to start using Duplicatas as a valid asset, or an efficient asset to be used as collateral, will certainly foster a lot loan transactions, credit transactions backed by Duplicatas. So I think definitely this is something not restricted to any given sector in the country. It's on all of the bonds that we see in the Brazilian marketplace, very likely Duplicata is the one that it's widely used by far by all sectors. So I think this is also something not restricted to a given sector of the Brazilian economy.
Exactly. And when you look at companies that have a combination of credit card receivables and duplicata trade, boleto financings, you in the past could have quite easily done collateral over credit cards, but then the big portion of your revenue was just not accessible as a collateral, and now it will be. And as well as companies that have never been able to use that as collateral because they don't have credit card receivables. Obviously, it's just it's a new dawn of a very, very big opportunity, and everything that we've talked about here is kind of very Brazilian, but we want to emphasize again that it's not just local financings. This technology can and will be used by international financings in the exact same way as I could pull up any number of credit card receivables pledges for international financings. That will become the same and the norm in respect of duplicata financings as well. We don't have any additional Q&A, so I think we can finish the webinar here. We will make this recording available to participants, and we'll also make the slides available online as well. And we're available for any questions. Thank you very much for everyone's time today. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thanks.